The Underground Railroad. If you were like me, you grew up in an environment where the Underground Railroad was something that happened on the East Coast. You know, Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass and, you know, people did stuff out of Virginia going up into New York and all of that. When we started Governor State 53 years ago, when we started Governor State, I immediately started working with the historic black communities around the south suburbs. And as a matter of fact, we need to talk. I had a whole group of really interesting African American students in the 70s that were all Joliet based. So there's a story to explore there. But as I was working with leadership in the historic black communities south of Chicago, every once in a while there was a mention of the Underground Railroad. And I thought, well, that's strange, maybe silly. I mean, that all happened on the East Coast. And that occasional encounter eventually shaped itself into some questions and some research. And so over the last 25 years, I have gotten very, very serious about that research. And so what I would like to share with you this evening is an understanding of the fact and the reality that the Underground Railroad was very much a part of our history here south of Chicago. There are really two great cycles of stories having to do with the Underground Railroad. There's one great cycle about the people that escaped their enslavement, freedom seekers that were on the road and found all kinds of ways to escape. And there is another great cycle of stories about the people that responded to them, the networks that become the underground, we call the Underground Railroad. Now the dilemma is that for the last 160 years, until about 10 years ago, almost all the stories we were telling were stories about the Underground Railroad itself and all of the good abolitionists that were responding to people coming out of slavery. And almost all of those people were white people. And what we need to do, just as you have talked about reclaiming some African American voices here in the region, we really need to really rebalance this whole conversation because of the importance not only of the stories of the people that assisted, but also the remarkable stories about people that escaped their enslavement. This, by the way, is the first image of an underground railroad that was published in 1844 in Chicago by a radical abolitionist newspaper called the Western Citizen. And of course, the Underground Railroad was not underground and it was not a railroad. Remember that. It was, in fact, the network of responses to the visiting of people on their way to freedom. So how do we reframe this whole conversation? Reframe it and recover it, reclaim it. And first of all, you notice I talk about freedom seekers. We, of course, are talking about people that we've all known as the fugitive slaves of the 19th century. But slave is a category of property. When I do my research, I'm not looking at population records, I'm looking at property records, at estate sales and tax sales, and there, with the horses and the cows and the pigs, there's the slaves. Property. And around the country, those of us that are involved in this have chosen rather to talk about people escaping their enslavement as freedom seekers to affirm their fundamental human intention that as human beings they wanted to be free and they wanted their children to be free. So people escaping their enslavement were doing that because of their fundamental desire to seize their own freedom. And of course, the language of the day was they were fugitive slaves, they were property. And we need to change that. We need to reframe that to understand folks not as property, but as human beings seeking their freedom. Secondly, we need to understand that the freedom seekers were the protagonists. We have this old mythology that says, well, all of these good white abolitionists created this Underground Railroad network, and then they went and helped the slaves. That's not true, right? What happened was all over the country, people escaping their enslavement got into free states, and occasionally they needed some help. And as they needed help, people responded. And over time, the people that were responding to the journeys of these freedom seekers put together what we know as the networks of the Underground Railroad. So the freedom seekers are the protagonists. They were not poor, helpless, confused slaves. No, they were men and women who, by any means necessary, were going to seize their freedom. And the Underground Railroad develops in response to their activity. And then a third thing we need to talk about to reframe is that as people were responding, again, we have a mythology over the last 160 years that it was basically a bunch of good white guys that formed the Underground Railroad and were helping the freedom seekers. And again, that's not the case. They did, but it was a much, much richer kind of environment. Because, first of all, think about it. If some family knocks on your door and says, gee, can we sleep in your barn tonight? You know, that's not a decision made by the guys, that's a decision made by the family. You know, it's the men and women and their children deciding consciously, we will break the law to help these people. So it was not a bunch of guys making these decisions, but it was families making these decisions. And we've got lots of cycles of stories of women who were directly involved in providing the leadership in the Underground Railroad that was responding to freedom seekers. So we need to understand it was a much more diverse kind of environment. I have a wonderful book from 1912. White guy. Most of the Underground Railroad stuff is white guys, old white guys writing about old white guys, which makes it tricky. But I've got this one old white guy in 1912 wrote a book and he said, I have seriously studied the Underground Railroad in Chicago and I've identified the 12 white men that ran it. You know, that's just not true, as you'll see. So we need to do this kind of reframing to see it was so much more diverse, and then also to affirm the fact there was a tremendous amount of activity here in Illinois, not just the East Coast, but Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio probably saw more activity with freedom seekers and Underground Railroad responses than the East Coast. But we've really got to reframe that story. And then finally, I think it's really important that we're talking about the journeys of freedom seekers, and you'll see on my maps and stuff that I'm always emphasizing journeys and the places that are connected together. Historically, Underground Railroad stuff talks about specific sites, and we need to talk about the sites and the journeys and get on with it. As we get into looking at that, please remember that which freedom seekers were escaping from, the brutal reality of slavery. People kidnapped in Africa, captured in Africa. 12 million people were brought across the Atlantic Ocean, enslaved. Of those, about 400,000 came to what we know as the United States. And this remarkable puzzle about what does it mean for somebody to own somebody. Okay? To understand how deeply serious that is. Oh, you. I can kill you because you are my property. Oh, you. I can rape you because you are my property. We can't even begin to imagine that kind of relationship with people owning other people. And it was out of that context that people, by any means necessary, said, we will be free. And they took off. Now, they went in all kinds of directions. Coming out of the South, this is a map from 1850, and coming out of the South, people went to Mexico, they went to the Caribbean, they commandeered ships and took them up to New England, and some went to live with native peoples in the West. Large majority came into the northern states, and that's where our story begins to focus. And notice on the map a couple interesting things. One is that the red states are the free states, and the dark states are the slave states. Okay, now notice that Illinois is kind of like a dagger going down into the South. And make no mistake, southern Illinois was southern. when the Civil War broke out, one county in southern Illinois seceded, voted to secede. And then when the federal troops arrived, they thought better of it and decided they would stay in Illinois. Southern Illinois is very much a part of the South, and that created a certain set of unique circumstances for people seeking their freedom in Illinois as a free state. Now, another thing that the map can be helpful with is to recognize, I'm going to do it on this map over here, that Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware were slave states. However, they did not secede. Abraham Lincoln was president of a union of free and slave states. And one of the reasons the stuff about Lincoln gets so complicated is because he was always having to deal with that dynamic, that he was president of free and slave states. Remember, when he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, he freed the slaves in the Confederacy, he did not free the slaves in Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware. All right, it's a very tricky set of stories trying to figure out kind of the geography of enslavement. Another thing that's interesting about the map is that if you draw a line from Cairo and the southern counties of Illinois, they are further south than most of the state of Virginia. Okay, this is the South. Now, my research suggests that somewhere between 4,500 and 7,000 people seeking their freedom came into Illinois. They came up the Mississippi River Valley out of the deep South. The vast number came from Missouri and Kentucky. And if you can imagine, if you were an enslaved person and you walk to the Mississippi River and you look across, that's freedom right there. All I got to do is get across that river. And so it's no surprise that many of the folks that come into Illinois come out of Missouri. And then coming up into our part of the world, my estimate is that somewhere between 2,500 and 4,500 people, and this is in the decades before the Civil War. Civil War starts in 1861, so in the 1820s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and 1860. These are people that are seeking their freedom, and at least 3,000 folks find their way into northern Illinois. My focus has been on this part of Illinois and northwest Indiana, and I've really found that there were really people seeking their freedom discovered very early on that they had to get out of Dodge. The great irony was, to be free in the land of the free, you had to leave. And so people early on knew they had to get to Canada. And so if you were coming up through Illinois, making it into the Chicago region, you then had to get to Detroit and freedom in Canada. And there have been two kind of routes that you will be familiar with. One route goes to and through Chicago, and it comes right through where we are. The other route went bypass Chicago and followed basically the corridor of the Sauk Trail. So significant numbers of folks getting into basically the Will County area, significant numbers deciding to go on to Chicago, others deciding to go straight east on their way to Detroit and then freedom in Canada. So these two kind of streams of movement coming through. My research has found that there are probably, I've been able to identify 60 places in northern Illinois where freedom seekers found assistance. And 20 of those, and probably more, will be identified in the city of Chicago. And the dilemma is that we have done very little deep research on most of those sites. There is really good evidence, but a lot of work needs to be done. So, by the way, students looking for a project, you want to do a history project, I'll set it up for them. I've got research protocol, I got everything. So we can engage you in some pretty interesting stuff. My research also suggests that in northwest Indiana, there are at least 19 places we've identified where we're very clear that freedom seekers found assistance. Now, on that first stream of people coming to and through Chicago, they came up all of these roads that you're familiar with, and also they came up traveling along the I-9 Canal, and some actually came on the I-9 Canal. I've got a couple of just hilarious stories about encounters with freedom seekers on the I-9 Canal. And of course, we're sitting right there. Okay? Now, do you understand? Route 50, is that the right direction? 53? That way. Okay, sorry. 53. Right there. People on their way to freedom walked. Okay? I mean, this is not Harriet Tubman in Virginia. This is human beings right here on Route 53. And they walked for their freedom. Right here. Okay, now, my work, well, let me stick with this story. So anyways, people came up out of the Mississippi River, following the Illinois River Valley, coming up following the I&M Canal, and following these historic roads that led them into Chicago, where fairly rapidly in the 1830s, people living in Chicago began to respond and help out people that were on their way to freedom. So there were these very strong networks. Now, the traditional history in Illinois, if you read any books before mine, of course, if you read any old books about Illinois history or Chicago history, they will tell you the Underground Railroad started in 1839 when a couple of white guys helped this poor, ravished, bedraggled black guy who needed help. And that's simply identified as the start by a bunch of white guys who wanted to tell their story. And that's great. However, the real story is that from the very beginning, there were black families living in Chicago, and from the very beginning of Chicago's history and our regional history, people were on their way to freedom coming through Chicago in the 1830s. In 1838, a really remarkable human being named Louis Isbell arrived in Chicago. And of course, you all recognize that name, right? Huh? Louis Isbell was key to leadership in the black community in Chicago from 1838 to 1905. And he had his hand in everything. And nobody talks about Louis Isbell. He was born enslaved in Kentucky, got his freedom in Illinois, comes to Chicago in 1838, and is literally in the thick of it, responding to the needs of freedom seekers for decades, and hooks up with all these other people. In addition, in the late 1830s, a group of young white families arrive and they start to respond. Freedom seekers show up on your doorstep. What are you going to do? Okay, you either push them away or you say, all right, we will break the law. And the laws were awful and serious and terrible. But people made the decision, we will break the law to help these people who are already breaking the law on their way to freedom. So a group of young white families come in the late 1830s, and they start responding to freedom seekers. And in the mid-1840s, they're joined by a remarkable group of young black families. And after 1850, and the horrendous fugitive slave law of 1850, these black families really provide the leadership for the Underground Railroad in Chicago. And some of us maintain that what was going on is really the first great civil rights movement in Chicago and northeastern Illinois, because there were white families and black families working together seriously to help freedom seekers that were traveling through. And it's just remarkable that in the 1840s and 50s, our country had this great chasm of race. And here were people in Chicago and the farms around Chicago that just reached across that chasm and said, the demands of humanity are such that we will help and we will work together. And there's a remarkable cycles of stories about all of these activities. In Chicago, an amazing group of white families. Of course, most of the time we've only got pictures of the men. Again, interesting. But Alan Pinkerton, the great private eye, the guy that starts the Secret Service and the private eyes, he began his secret work helping freedom seekers. And there was a terrific guy named Dr. Charles Dyer and his wife Louisa Dyer, and Charles and Louisa really provided the leadership. And these were in the late 1830s, these were all these families, people in their late 20s and 30s. They had little kids, And they took this so seriously that said, we will break the law. Then in the 1840s, there was this remarkable group of young white black families that come into Chicago, led by John and Mary Richardson Jones, who some of you may know. John Jones has had some visibility in Chicago history. And a group of very, very interesting things that they were involved with. Commercial note, there are lots of stories about these folks in my book. Okay. The key, oh, thank you, Dennis. There you go. Thank you. By the way, I do have, I've taken a break. I do have books for sale. And my lovely assistant, Vanna White, my lovely assistant here, it's my wife, Lil. Lil will be glad to sell you some books. Now, within that black community that was providing the key leadership for responding to freedom seekers coming through, there were two remarkable churches. Quinn Chapel, which still exists, and Zoar Baptist Church, which becomes Olivet Baptist Church, which still exists. And it is just remarkable the kinds of ways that people found to be supportive of freedom seekers that were coming through. Now, in that first stream going to and through Chicago, a lot of people came up along the I&M Canal, and just 5 minutes from here is this the I&M Canal headquarters building, built in 1836. That has been designated by the National Park Service as an official Network to Freedom site on the register of Underground Railroad places. I helped put that application together, but this place is there to honor and recognize the fact that a significant number of freedom seekers came right up your road, right up the I&M Canal, and right through this region. The National Park Service 25 years ago created the Network to Freedom. There are now over 600 places around the United States that have been designated as places where freedom seekers found assistance. And it's really exciting that we have a number of sites in Illinois that are on that national register. In addition, last summer, the state of Illinois, the legislature, created the Underground Railroad Task Force. They asked 10 people around the state to be on that task force. I was asked to be one of those, and we are putting together a plan on what should a permanent state agency do to support this research and these activities, understanding the stories of freedom seekers, very analogous to reclaiming the narratives here that you all have been doing. And my hunch is we will be recommending to the legislature that they create what we're calling the Illinois Freedom Trails Commission. And we'll be putting together a variety of sets of activities so there'll be a place where people will be looking at this systematically, because this has been hidden history for so very long. In the western suburbs, there's a wonderful place called the Sheldon and Harriet Peck Home, also on the Network to Freedom. Remarkable ways in which they were helping freedom seekers, and recognized that coming through the western suburbs and a little bit through the northern suburbs, there were people, and we've got unique stories of people coming from places like Galena, making their way to Chicago to be safe. Chicago really was a kind of sanctuary city, and most of the time was fairly safe, but not often. That also is on the Network to Freedom. Now, my particular work has been on looking at the region south of Chicago, and part of it is looking at two areas of Dutch settlement, areas we know today as Roseland and South Holland. And the remarkable military road in 1825 was built from Detroit to Chicago, and that road is kind of the main way that people were moving from Chicago to Detroit on their way to freedom. And there were these two Dutch settlements there, and right on the historic road to Detroit was the farmhouse of a guy named Cornelius and Marche Kuiper, and down on the Little Calumet River was the farm of the Tuns. And these are people that I've been doing a lot of work on. The Kuipers had this store and farm right on what is now Michigan Avenue in Roseland, and they responded to and helped freedom seekers. And then Cornelius Kuiper and Jan Tun were instrumental in establishing a couple of the Dutch churches, and also they were the only two Dutch guys that spoke English. And so as freedom seekers would come down out of Chicago, remember Chicago was a little tiny town the size of the Loop. As they came down out of, and they ran into these Dutch farmers, they would get directed to the Kuipers and to the Tuns to get some assistance. We have the Tun Farm, which was located on the Little Calumet River, has been designated on the National Register, and we have installed a big historic marker. We had a grand celebration in 2022. That's Lieutenant Governor Juliana Stratton. There's Congresswoman Robin Kelly, Commissioner Donna Miller. In the back, the guy in the sunglasses is the Dutch Consul General in Chicago. And then, much to our delight, 2 weeks ago, we were visited by the Dutch ambassador to the United States, who was really excited to come and see this place where Dutch immigrants were involved in the freedom struggle. And that's the ambassador right there. She's a very tall person. We had just a really wonderful, rich experience with her. So that first stream goes around Lake Michigan, around the bottom of Lake Michigan. That's where the Tun Farm is. Those are folks that went to and through Chicago, probably 1,500 to 2,000 people. Then the other stream followed the Sauk Trail corridor. And some of you may know the Sauk Trail. It was a trail for Native peoples for hundreds of years. This is the only picture we've got. But you can see the way that the trail has been worn by hundreds of years of people dragging their horses and ponies and their families back and forth. The Sauk Trail extended from the indigenous cities along the Mississippi, reaching all the way to Detroit, so that they could engage with the Dutch traders, or the French traders and the British traders, and then the Americans. Just south of the Sauk Trail in Crete, there is a still standing church. This church was built in 1859, and the folks that built this church in 1839 organized themselves, and they were one of the first churches in Illinois that passed a resolution on the evils of slavery, and that we must stand against slavery. That is also on the Network to Freedom and very close to my house. Now, there are these two streams going to and through Chicago and then going straight across, and several thousand people following these streams overland. And we've talked in general terms. Of course, they were going to Detroit and Freedom in Canada, and they went across Northwest Indiana, but we haven't known exactly what they did. I'm pretty clear about the ways that people came up to Chicago, but we weren't exactly clear. And so we started to say, where exactly did freedom seekers go? And I began looking at the historic roads. And there's the old Sauk Trail. In 1825, the federal government established a military road between Chicago and Detroit, and lo and behold, as they built the road, they decided to follow the Sauk Trail most of the way to Chicago. And we've got a great cycle of stories about that. In addition, in the early 1830s, the state of Michigan, territory of Michigan, created the territorial road going west to Lake Michigan, and then there were other roads that developed. And all of those roads were developed so that American settlers, European Americans, could get to the west. And now, in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s, those exact corridors become ways that freedom seekers get into Illinois, and then you go east to find their freedom. So we said, looking at that, can we create a national historic trail to honor the journeys of these freedom seekers? And so we've done an awful lot of work identifying a route that starts along the Sauk Trail down in Crete, and another route that starts in Bronzeville. And we are proposing and working seriously with working groups of people all along this route. How do we do this in ways that will commemorate the journeys of freedom seekers and the networks of response in the Underground Railroad? And again, any of you that are teachers or education folk, if you want to work on curricula about some of this stuff or work on some projects, we have got a boatload of projects, and hopefully, it's been all volunteer, but hopefully this summer we're going to start having some money to help us do this work. But the intent is to develop a Chicago to Detroit Freedom Trail that commemorates these journeys and the networks of response. Now, I want to close with two stories. Freedom seeker stories are always journey stories. People coming out of their enslavement, and they had to hit the road. Now, we know, by the way, there were a number of people that escaped their enslavement and didn't leave. You know, they went into the mountains, they went into the woods, and stayed in contact with their families. But probably somewhere between 35,000 and 50,000 people literally left the South to escape their enslavement. And all of those are journey stories. Now, in 1843, Caroline Quarles was enslaved in a house in St. Louis, Missouri. She was the daughter of her master's son and a slave woman in the household named Maria. When Robert Quarles Jr. was 28, he decided to get married, and as part of his wedding arrangements, he thought he just would rape some of the slave women. And Maria was 17, and Caroline was the result. Caroline grew up, this is the only picture we have of Caroline in her later years. Caroline grew up a beautiful young woman, pale skin, freckles, blue eyes, long black hair, and she was enslaved. And she grew up in the same household with her free cousins. And of course, the cousins always had it in for her because they could tell her to do whatever they wanted. When Caroline was 16 years old, 1843, she decided she had had enough and she wanted to be a free person. I also think, we don't know this from the record, but I think that Caroline understood that as an attractive young woman, she could be kidnapped and she could be taken to New Orleans and she would spend her life in a brothel. And she was not going to do that. But Caroline wanted to be free, and so she put some money together. She went down to the docks, passing as a white person, got a ticket on a riverboat north, and started this kind of amazing saga. Caroline traveled by riverboat to Galena. She got to Galena, Illinois, and there's one black guy living in Galena. He sees her get off the boat, and he says, "We know you're passing. The slave catchers are right behind you. They've got $800 on your head, and they want you." Now, that was a pretty common price for a fugitive slave. $800 would translate into about $18,000 to $20,000 today. Okay? So you can believe that people wanted Caroline because that was $20,000 worth of property that they were going to recapture. So anyways, the black guy says, "You're passing, the slave catchers are coming." He put her on the first stage out of Dodge. The stage went to Milwaukee. Got to Milwaukee, there were white abolitionists that had never seen a fugitive slave in Milwaukee. Remember, slavery was a long way away from northern Illinois and Wisconsin and Michigan. And so we've got a remarkable set of stories about how the slave catchers arrived in Milwaukee and the abolitionists keep shuttling Caroline around to protect her. Finally, they agree that one of them will serve as her escort. They get a buggy and some horses, and they decide that they are going to escort Caroline, the 16-year-old girl, 1843. They're going to escort her to Canada. And so they come down around, they avoid Chicago because of the slave catchers, and they come down. They stayed overnight in Dundee, in Naperville. They came very likely right down this road. Somehow they came down out of Naperville, crossed the canal into Lockport, then into Homer Township, New Lenox, and then they stayed several nights in Crete, and then went on further. But this kind of remarkable person, I mean, can you imagine? 16 years old, traveled 1,200 miles for her freedom. She got to Canada after a couple years. Met a young guy that had escaped out of Kentucky, Alan Watkins. They married. They had a bunch of children, and their descendants now live in Detroit and Canada. And Lil and I, one of the honors of our life was that we got to know very well and a dear friend, Charlotte Watkins, who was Caroline's great-granddaughter. And a remarkable woman in her own right, and she passed 2 years ago. With another one of Caroline's descendants, I ended up writing a book about Caroline's life, and we do have that available if you're intrigued in knowing more details about the story. But can you imagine 1843, 16 years old, 1,200 miles? Could you do that? In 1841, John and Eliza Little were enslaved on adjoining farms in western Tennessee. John had a rough life. John was born in Virginia. His parents had come over on a slave ship in chains to Virginia. And John was born there. And all of his life, John told people, I know my parents. There is not a drop of white blood in me. I am the son of African princes. And needless to say, that got him in a lot of trouble. And he carried a bullet fragment in his shoulder all of his life and the scars on his back because he was going to be his own person. So he goes from Virginia, he's sold to West Virginia, he's sold to Kentucky, he ends up being sold to a farmer in western Tennessee. On the adjoining farm, Eliza is there. John and Eliza meet, they fall in love, they get married, and then they realize the only way we can have a good life is we have got to escape. We've got to get out of this. And so they make plans, and late one night in the spring of 1841, they decided that they were going to make their way to freedom. And so they went up, they followed the Tennessee River up to the Ohio River, and then they were going to get into Illinois because Illinois was free. So John and Eliza they had a few possessions, and they were following the Tennessee River, going north to the Ohio. It goes into the Ohio just below Illinois. And they got to a swamp. And years later, John told people, we got to that swamp, and I put Eliza on a log, and the possessions we have I put behind her, and I pushed that log through the swamp. And I knew that at any moment, if I misstepped, I would lose everything I loved. And John did not misstep. They made their way through the swamp. They got to the Ohio River, and they, shall we say, they borrowed a boat, and they got across the Ohio River, and they're on the Illinois side, and they're exhausted. They start a campfire just very close to the Ohio River on the Illinois side, and some other freedom seekers happen to see their fire and come and sit down with them. And these other freedom seekers said to John and Eliza, you know, this has been a tough passage. You know, Cairo's just a few miles from here. Why don't we go to Cairo and turn ourselves in? And if we go back, you know, maybe our master won't really punish us. I mean, we turn ourselves in. Years later, Eliza told folks, I heard them say that, and I stood up and I said, I know where we have been, and I know where I must go, and if need be, I will walk barefoot to Chicago for my freedom. John and Eliza Little walked 370 miles to Chicago to be free people. Now we now have dozens and dozens of stories, but it is so remarkable that we now know so much about people that were enslaved and made that fundamental human choice to be free people. And so we want to keep telling those stories and keep exploring those stories and honoring those stories and honoring all the folks that helped them. But realizing that we've got these two great cycles, all these remarkable stories of people on their way to freedom, and all these remarkable stories about people that helped them. And if some of you want to, come help me dig. Thank you.